Hi, Danielle. Thank you very much for joining us today. How are things in Dallas?
They're great. They're pretty toasty. It feels like summertime outside. So I'm envying you for way further north in Toronto.
And how warm is it in Dallas?
It's pushing 90 degrees. So that's kind of toasty for an April.
That is getting up there. It is currently about 70 degrees in Toronto, which is not too bad. I don't mind that at all. So if you're in Dallas, you must be a Cowboys fan.
Well, most people would think that, but I actually grew up a bit south of here in San Antonio. And at the time, the Houston Oilers were the big rivals in the state. So I grew up with the Houston Oilers and Warren Moon, who got to be more popular in your neck of the woods.
Yeah, that's a name I have not heard in a long time.
Well, he was one of the greats. Yes.
So that's enough about football. Let's move on. And I want to pick your brain about the Fed. And I want to start by asking you some very intimate questions about the Fed. You were on the Federal Reserve Bank of Dallas for 9 years, and you had an inside look into how things are done there. And you wrote a book about your experience at the Fed, and the book is called Fed Up. And you have stated that the Fed is made up of a bunch of academics who have no idea of the real world, and they are fixated on theoretical models. Do you still believe this, or has your opinion changed?
No, I wish that my opinion had changed. It seems like, if anything, they have delved further into the theoretical since I left in 2015. I think that had the academics not cooked up this cockamamie notion of average inflation targeting a few years ago, that the Fed wouldn't really have tied itself to this whole idea of transitory, even though it's proven to be exactly that. It's just not that. That's just not how they communicated policy at the time. But again, when you get tethered to theoretical models, it often is a disservice, because you end up not being able to see what's happening on the ground. And that's why I've always advocated to put more practitioners at the Fed.
And the Fed is supposed to be non-political. Do you think they are?
I think that Jay Powell is the least political leader at the Fed since Paul Volcker was there. Greenspan and definitely Bernanke, and incredibly Yellen, yes. To greater and greater extents, his three predecessors became more and more politicized in their tenures at the Fed.
And one more question about the Fed before we move on, but
Sure.
I'm always amazed at the Fed. They are, especially under Powell, they are always talking, not just Powell, but all of them. And why is that?
So, Bernanke was the one who introduced the press conference that followed every FOMC meeting. It certainly hadn't been like that. My gosh, when Alan Greenspan began at the Fed, the statement itself wasn't even made public at the end of the meeting. But it seems like Fed communications really have taken on a life of their own subsequent to opening the door to a greater level of communication. And now it's become its own weapon of mass destruction, because you get all of this confusing talk, and then they come together and there's rarely a dissent. So they're disruptive to the market in what they say, and then they're confusing to the market in what they do.
But they must have a comms team. There must be somebody behind all of this saying, okay, let's go out and talk to whomever, and this is the message we're going to pitch.
There is a lot of coordination, and individuals who are leaders at certain district banks who are extremely dovish in their academic leanings, in their personal philosophies, in their politics. When they come across as being different than what they are in their roots, yes, you can tell that there's been very, very much in the way of coordination in the background of messaging.
So let's move on now. I want to get your thoughts on the economy, and the economy appears to be doing very well. It's growing at 3 to 4% annualized. We've had 25 consecutive quarters of unemployment below 4%. And the last time we saw that was in 1969. The stock market was also doing very well up until the last week or 2 weeks here, but it's been coming under pressure for various reasons. But overall, how do you think the economy is doing?
So I think this great, big, wonderful U.S. economy is, I think that the National Bureau of Economic Research is going to look back and declare that the U.S. economy was in recession as we speak. It's a very complicated question and it's a very complicated answer. You can pick apart many of the things that are occurring and say, okay, Danielle, well, do you not see that retail spending was gangbusters? I'll say, sure. But what was growing at a faster pace? What has been growing at a faster pace than retail spending for 9 quarters in a row? That would be the growth of credit card spending. So you say to yourself, is that really a strong U.S. consumer? Or is that a U.S. consumer that maintains access to credit? Because we know that 340,000 layoffs have been announced so far in 2024. That's a level that surpasses that of 2023, which had been the highest since 2009. So we're talking about corporate America that is very much in a cost-cutting mode, which is great for the stock market. Shareholders like that. But we've seen the unemployment rate, yes, south of 4% for a very long time. And yet it has moved from 3.4% to 3.8%. And a gentleman by the name of Ed McKelvey, he was the chief economist at Goldman Sachs years before Claudia Sahm introduced her own rule. He had his own. So in January of 2010, he was interviewed by the Wall Street Journal, and he said the unemployment rate is 0.35 percentage points off of its lows. If it maintains that level, which it had through December of 2008, it was 2008. But if it maintains that level for 3 months or more, then historically speaking, in the post-war U.S. economy, the U.S. economy has been in recession. And that's where we've been for several months now. So in order for me to presuppose that what the media tells us is simply the case, that would mean that it has to be different this time. And well, I have to dye the hair to keep it from being gray, but I've been around for long enough to know that that it's different this time. They're four very, very dangerous words.
And so let's talk about interest rates now. And in the March dot plot, it was suggesting we were going to have 3 cuts this year, but a lot has happened in the last few weeks. And when you look at the 10-year, it's gone from a low of close to 4% in early March to 4.65% now. And I'm curious, where do you think interest rates are going to go this year? And what do you think this move in the 10-year is telling us?
So I think the move in the 10-year is telling you exactly how traders are positioned. And traders are positioned for rates to rise. Chair Powell, Jerome Powell, continues to speak to the dangers of inflation not being tamed yet. And as long as he sticks to his narrative about that, then I think the bond market is going to pay heed to the fact that the Fed is not going to be tightening policy anytime soon. In fact, I believe the first rate cut is now priced out to November, the 2 days after Election Day, November the 7th. So very few opportunities now to cut interest rates. But of course, the March dot plot also lowered the threshold to 4.0% from December's dot plot, which said the unemployment rate target for the end of the year 2024 had been 4.1%. So the Fed said, no, we think it's going to end 2024 at 4.0%. But the mirror image of that means that from its current 3.829 position, the unemployment rate only has to rise a smidgen to get to 3.945 and be rounded up to 4%, which would trigger a Fed rate cut cycle, which nobody's really paying attention to.
And so you were talking about inflation, and we had a very strong CPI number recently. We had very strong retail numbers also. And just with regard to the CPI, a big part of that had to do with services. Car insurance, for example, was up. I believe it was up 22% year over year, and that's the biggest move we saw since 1976. And then we had these hostilities over in the Middle East, which might lead to higher oil prices. And when you look at all of these events, do you not think that maybe Powell is correct that inflation is still being very stubborn? It's not coming down, and maybe there's a good chance that it keeps increasing as we go into year end, and maybe we even see higher interest rates come 2025.
Anything is in the realm of possibilities. But of course, the idea that inflation is being stubborn, this misses the fact that inflation that the Fed can influence is being anything but stubborn. In fact, LVMH was out today. The luxury goods massive conglomerate was out today saying, people aren't buying our very expensive handbags. And in fact, when you look at the inflation rate for things that we would like to buy, we call them discretionary purchases. When you look at that inflation rate, it's running at 0.7%. And you're seeing, especially the people who are well-to-do, those who make more than 125,000, you're seeing spending decline, whether it's airfares or hotels or recreational spending. You're seeing those levels of spending come down, and that it speaks to the fact that there's a certain fallacy that it is services inflation that's holding things up. Of course, there's no control that Chair Powell would have over a 22% year-over-year increase in automobile insurance. That's the culmination of several years of car insurance companies appealing to regulatory bodies to raise car insurance premiums. And why wouldn't they? A new car price in the United States got all the way almost up to $50,000. So if that car's totaled and you're the insurance company, you need to have a lot more money on hand than you did prior to the pandemic, keeping semiconductors out of cars and pushing those prices up. But in terms of the things that monetary policy has influence over, which certainly isn't hostilities in the Middle East either, Chair Powell's job is complete. In fact, he often quotes what he calls supercore inflation, which is a services gauge. And boy, the street loves to quote right after him. And it came in with the CPI report at a 4.8% year-over-year rate. And then you start to pick at it, and it's 28% of the weight of the CPI. The only thing that's a bigger weight is shelter inflation. That's got a 34% weight. But you look inside of Supercore and you realize that 50% of that increase was solely auto insurance and the cost to repair the car. Without those two inputs that are only algebraically 16% of the 28%, Supercore was down to 2.4%, a nothing burger. So sometimes it definitely pays to peel the onion back a few layers and understand what underlying inflation is doing. But that doesn't benefit Chair Powell. He wants to continue shrinking the size of the Fed's balance sheet, and it benefits him to be able to lean on inflation metrics as he does, even if he knows that they're not necessarily revealing the reality on the ground.
That's an interesting comment you made too about Louis Vuitton. I believe the parent company of Gucci also came out with reduced sales here a couple of weeks ago. So it's interesting to see what's happening in the high end part of the market.
And of course, high end is responsible, the highest quintile of earners in the United States, they're responsible for 38.6% of the consumption that is 70% of US GDP. So what people at the high end are doing really matters for the economy.
So you made mention earlier of this famous quote, inflation is transitory, and that's what Powell and his friends were saying back in 2021. And then by March of 2022, they woke up to the fact that inflation was not transitory, and they started hiking rates rather quickly. And do you think right now the Fed is making another policy error, and that it sounds like you think inflation is not as high as Powell thinks it is, and therefore they're leaving rates up too high, too long?
It's very possible that Powell is knowingly committing a policy error. There are for multiple generations, the non-banking sector, we'd have to have another few hours to discuss this, but for multiple generations, the non-banking sector, which for the ease of magnitude is about $250 trillion globally. That compares to the conventional banking system, which is $180 trillion globally. So the non-banking system, the shadow banking system, is appreciably larger than the regulated conventional banking system. There is something for your viewers to Google called Basel III. And if Jay Powell is able to press forward with modernizing regulations such that they reach all the way into the shadow banking system, he will have accomplished quite a bit in his tenure. In order to do that, though, he's going to have to be higher for longer. So he's got to find a reason to be higher for longer, even if it's making the choice of the lesser of two evils. So again, another discussion for another day. I invite everybody to Google Basel III and look into the implications for regulating how the non-banks are funded, how they access funding, and how cheap funding is right now compared to what it would be in a post Basel III world.
And of course, we have an election coming up here in not too many months in November. Do you think that's going to come into play at all? Because the window for the Fed to do something, it's closing.
It is. And, even if there is potentially an increase past that 4.0% threshold on the unemployment rate from the current 3.8 to 9%, if it's too close to the election, I could see Chair Powell, who, again, he's the least political Fed leader in 40 years. I could see him wanting to hold off on making any kind of a move until he was not being viewed as trying to influence the outcome of the election one way or another.
Danielle, as we wrap up, I just want you to summarize. It sounds like you're concerned about the economy and what's going to happen in the coming months. Maybe you can just summarize for us what these concerns are.
So, we've seen, well more than 1,000 announcements that stores were going to be closing in the United States. So if they were the Walking Dead, so be it. That's still a lot of affected individuals. The fact that layoff announcements are at the highest since 2009. I mean, these are real people, and the rate at which prices are rising for non-discretionary items, things that are completely out of the Fed's control. It's highly problematic, especially for families that are in the crosshairs and losing their incomes to layoffs and to cutbacks. So I wish that there was an elegant, easy answer for central banking officials, but there isn't right now. We've had decade after decade after decade of missteps and delving too deep into unconventional monetary policy, zero interest rate policy, quantitative easing run wild. And as a very younger Jay Powell said in October of 2012, when he was a rookie on the Federal Reserve Board, the odds are increasingly growing that if we get into a multiple $trillion balance sheet, that when the time comes to extricate ourselves, it's going to be a very difficult task indeed. And but the irony that it's Jay Powell himself who has now been tasked with trying to do just that, knowing as he did more than a decade ago how difficult and how challenging it would be. And that's exactly what's proven to be the case.
Interesting comments. And before I let you go, you are a prolific writer. And when can we expect another book? And so what's the topic going to be?
Well, that's a really good question. And, the thought has occurred to me to write that next book, not necessarily have it be a sequel. There's certainly a lot that's happened in central banking, but at the moment I'm still publishing 8 times a week for QI Research. And it's a tremendous amount of work to keep the publication machine going. So for now, the book is rumbling around in my brain, but I've got an obligation to my clients first.
And I'm glad that you brought that up. If somebody wants to learn more about that, where can they go?
So please come to dimartinobooth.substack.com, or you can always go to my Twitter feed and learn more there about how to access the research, whether it's for the RIA retail community or for the institutional investor. We've got QI Pro. We've got a full spectrum of great research, publications, Bloomberg chat room, you name it, we've got it.
Well, that was a great discussion, and I want to thank you very much for spending time with us today.
And thank you for having me.